myth or fact. You cannot get tested anonymously. You must go through your doctor and insurance.
So those are all slightly different questions. So I'm going to pick them apart a little bit. You can get tested anonymously at some centers. It depends on the rules of that institution and kind of what they've set forth. And we did some research recently, had no intention of it becoming research, but we were looking at some issues around confidentiality and electronic medical records. And this came up a bit in our investigation into that. At our institution, we're not allowed to do anonymous testing per our institution, but I know there are plenty of others that do. So when you call an institution about testing, you can ask them specifically. The second part of the question is you must go through your doctor. You must go through a doctor. It is not currently part of any of the direct-to-consumer tests like 23andMe or any of these commercially available things. Huntington's is not part of those. So you have to go through some sort of provider, whether that's a doctor or a nurse practitioner, but some kind of prescribing provider would have to help you with that. Whether you have to go through your insurance, that's typically a myth. You don't have to. In the past, almost nobody did. I'm talking about pre-symptomatic testing primarily. I would say at our institution, it's about half and half now. About half the people are using insurance and half are choosing not to. I attribute that change to be due to some law changes that protect people's medical insurance that didn't exist when I started doing this. Sorry, I couldn't answer that with one quick myth or fact, but they are slightly separate questions.
No worries. Thank you.
I think it's worthwhile knowing that this anonymous testing thing is something that's argued and discussed back and forth among doctors in the field and hospitals and healthcare providers. And there's just a lot of disagreement. I know people who are very adamant about saying, yes, it should be available anonymously. And I know others that say, no, that's silly. It's going down the wrong track. You should not do it anonymously. I'd be interested in what Terry thinks about this. I personally don't like anonymous testing. I think it raises a lot of problems, particularly down the line as to who got testing when, does the result really match up with the right person, and identities can get very confused. And I have not liked the idea of anonymous testing, but I have colleagues who feel just the opposite. What goes on in Davis, Terry?
Tom, actually, just to say, I agree with you about the downstream problems when you do it anonymously. In the beginning, I'll tell you, historically, in the early years, like Stacy was saying, people at our institution could choose a pseudonym name, and all those downstream problems occurred. That actually wasn't a good idea. And when we hit a couple of roadblocks with that, we worked with our institution wasn't happy about it. We had to work with medical records people. We had to work with the ethics committees within UC Davis. And we came up with a system where people could have a numerical, they could still test not using their real name, not through insurance. If you're using insurance, it's your name, because there's no way to cycle it through your insurance unless you're using your name. This applies only to people who are paying out of pocket, and it's an alphanumeric number that's generated by the folks who helped us in the medical record, and Davis has electronic medical records, and has for a long time. But what happens in there, because one of the biggest downstream problems is if you test positive, but you don't have symptoms yet, and you may have a delay of 4, 5, 6 years before you would actually need care, you don't have a gene test in your name or that carries through, but we fixed that. So what happens is that alpha number assigned to the predictive testing carries through and actually can become their electronic medical record at UC Davis. So we fixed the electronic part of being able to do that test. Now, one of the things that will typically happen, say you have an instance where you have that person who tested under an alphanumeric pseudonym, becomes symptomatic, needs care, that gene test still has that alphanumeric and on it. And if it has to be submitted to anybody for eligibility for benefits, Social Security, or something like that, you actually have to do another gene test. Is what you have to do. So it sits in their name. So what that system does, and Tom's right, there's a ton of controversy. For the people who just feel so strongly about not using their name, it reduces a barrier for them. Whether ultimately it's the right thing to do, I think that changes. And as more people seek predictive testing, once we have a treatment, that will delay the onset, or we have a cure, that's just going to go out the window. That being said, I do know of a couple of instances where the question becomes, is disclosure or unintended disclosure of somebody's DNA result, does it happen in the real world? And I'd say most of the time, no. I think that people who test with their name can have a pretty good assurance that in an institution that will stay private, it will stay confidential. You guys know healthcare systems have just tons and tons of regulatory things about protections of people's medical information and HIPAA and GINA and all that kind of stuff. That stuff is true. But you know what? I actually do know of a couple of instances where unintended disclosure happened. And one person tested under their name, but he'd been a patient at this institution previously, like 10 years earlier, for a different medical condition. When he had the gene test, it was linked to that other account, and the bill was sent to his mother, and his result was disclosed to his mother without his consent. And but that's, like I said, in the hundreds that we've all experienced with people, your information is private. It's pretty bulletproof with, like I said, an exception of an occasional case.
Yeah, I think one thing we saw in real life that happened to one of our friends is they anonymous tested. They decided in years he was actually receiving care under that anonymous test, and then he needed benefits, Social Security, and all that record of data, all the data and stuff of them following them and everything, they weren't able to use to get the Social Security. They had to retest and start over again. I don't know if there's a loophole in that where that all that information could have been transferred over for when he applied for his Social Security, but I know those medical records are really important when it comes to getting benefits.
Yes, they are. And so to tell people, in that system that UC Davis developed, once a person was getting care, it's their real name. There's no more, you don't get care under a pseudonym at all, ever. That was only for people who were predictive testing and had not had a phenotypical conversion yet.
And just to be clear, the system that UC Davis put together is quite unique and special.
It is.
Most facilities are not going to have something this clever. And I think it's just really important when you inquire and have those initial conversations to ask, how do you do this at your institution? Who can see this information in my record? And this is what came up with the issue that we ended up kind of doing a bit of a research study on. Is we went to Epic, which is a very common electronic medical record. Prior to that, we had little siloed electronic medical records in each department. So it was easy to keep our records separate. But when we went to Epic, that means that any other institution that uses Epic can see that you've been tested, even if it's not your own institution. And people need that educated information before they ever step foot in the facility. Ask lots of questions about visibility of your data before you ever become a patient there.
That's a really good point, Stacey. I forgot to mention that. You're right. The UC Davis system is unique, and the majority of places aren't like that. You know, when I would tell people, it's okay because they generally are safe, but the providers that you're working with understand that need for confidentiality. And that was one of the other things built into that Davis system. That information, genetic testing's locked. You had to be identified within the system as being somebody who could view those results. And the only people who could view that genetic result was our team. That was it. No one else in the medical center could get into that locked file.